Hi everyone, this is Andrew Prima, Ukrainian American, reporting from Kiev. In today's podcast, week 57th of war in Ukraine, and this is the last week of March 2023. In today's podcast, Bakhmut is still the bloodiest place in the world. Putin cannot stop the war or offensive because it will mean the end of his power. And we will talk about Chinese leader. What his plans? Will he support Russia or not? Bakhmut is the place where the Russian army went to die. And I personally think that Putin continues to make blunder after blunder, violating all the principles of war. A year ago, he attacked Ukraine in the wrong month, in February. They do not attack in these conditions, but he continued to attack this year in February as well and in March, which are not the best times to go offensive. And all he did was destroying his own army. So, attacking in open ground, infantry against artillery, they lost so many troops. Today, the Ukrainian army kills about 25,000 Russian soldiers monthly. The figures for March will be similar, about 75,000 of Russian soldiers wounded. All the best units of the Russian army is being destroyed. It's a terrible time to attack. Therefore, when the right time for the offensive comes, which is spring, Ukraine will have a much stronger army, much better provision than it was a year ago. And you have to go on the offensive to win back positions. And I believe that this spring, Ukraine will have a very powerful counteroffensive that will shock the world. The probability of the collapse of the Russian army is increasing every day. They are being degraded to the point where they cannot replace their troops quickly. They cannot recruit enough people. They are unlikely to be able to carry out another mass mobilization without the people rioting. And they lose all their best equipment and ammunition. I mean, they're already taking T 55 and T 56 tanks to the battlefield. As you might know, these are historical museum exhibits of 1950s and 1960s that not being produced anymore. They bring more and more old things to the front lines, and it means that they're running out of the resources. This Ukrainian strategy was brilliant. Degrade the Russian during the winter, then counterattack when the Ukrainian army is stronger and better trained and now has a much better armed forces, not only with Leopard tanks, but also with mine resistant Bradley fighting vehicles and MRAPs. So there is a lot more opportunity to get into areas that are gonna be heavily mined, that are gonna be heavily defended to break through and surround and kill the Russian army in the region. I think ITASMs are necessary, and I believe they will be provided eventually. It's just a matter of time. They needed to operate deep into the districts and occupied territories where we cannot get now. Of course, you need the fighter jets F 16, but you didn't get them. It's good that we can get some Russian made MiG 27, 29 from our European allies. This will allow Ukraine to conduct more offensive air actions in support of ground operations. In essence, the Ukrainian offensive will be doctrine of air-ground combat, which NATO has predicted for years. It would be nice if we had ATASMs, but it's possible to go on the offensive without them as well. Ukraine is now getting the weapons it needed, and the question is quantity. We must continue to increase the number of these weapons until the victory. And as we know, our European allies are allocating all these weapons, but it takes time to deliver them to the front lines. What happens with the Chinese leader and his recent visit to Russia worries the world. I think that Xi Jinping would be a fool to intervene in his war now on the side of Russia. That doesn't mean he won't, but I think the Chinese are playing a long game. 2 years ago, there were three major military powers in the world: Russia, China, and the United States. And now, one of them is no longer an important competitor, thanks to the fact that the Ukraine military destroyed the Russian army. Now, moreover, the Russian economy is in ruins. The Russian army is in ruins as well. All they have just the nuclear weapons. The nuclear weapons they're threatening the world with. They have nothing to offer the world. Only nuclear weapons and gas. They are a gas station pretended to be a country. Xi Jinping see all this happening. If he starts supplying large weapon system to Russia, you know, the whole world will turn against him, and he doesn't want that. Don't forget, he has 2 billion people he needs to feed. He wants to be able to conquer the world economically. He wants to be liked by people. Now he has concluded some economic agreements with Russia that will benefit China. But I think that from a military point of view, he would be a fool to openly support Russia and escalate the situation. The only countries that support Russia at the moment are Congo, South Africa, and Belarus. None of this country is legitimate country, and this support is probably paid by the money. The rest of the world is for Ukraine, and China doesn't want to go against the whole world. I strongly believe that the Ukrainian army is currently the strongest army in Europe. They do a lot of things in the right way. Of course, you fight with that you collect all over the world, from Bushmasters from Australia to MRAPs from the United States, whatever you can get your hands on, you collect together. Any thought about which weapon would be better on the battlefield in Ukraine is a luxury that will only be available years after the victory. There is no way to choose now. You take whatever you can get and use it at your advantage. And we're truly appreciative for what our Western allies supply to Ukraine. And the Ukrainian army has proven to be incredibly innovative and adaptive, and the training time of your soldiers is much more intense and shorter. After the end of this war, the Ukrainian military will have something to teach the rest of Europe. Now is not the time, but I think the lessons learned here will be very important to the West to learn in case Russia attacks on them, which is also possible. The Ukrainian counteroffensive, when it occurs, will be first of all a well planned and coordinated attack. Wherever he goes, he will most likely break through the Russian lines, and I think that with the new combat power that Ukraine has already, this could be a decisive battle. Whether Ukraine will win in 2023 or 2024 remains to be guessed at. We are preparing for a long war, we hope for a short one. But I think that there will be a big decisive battle which Ukraine will decisively win. And it will also inspire the West to continue to support, to continue to increase weapons, ammunition, to increase training. Nothing helps gain support like success. We know that Russia's offensive matters to Putin a lot. It's a matter of life for him. Putin regularly declares his desire for peace, but with the usual condition that everyone, including Kiev, must first recognize all the recent annexations, including 4 regions: Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, which they have no intention of doing. If Putin ever agrees to give up these annexed territories, he will have problems at home. The right will be furious. if it turns out that they are ready to give up the territories declared by Russia. Everyone else will be furious that so much has been wasted for so little gain. So he has no choice but to continue with his current strategy. And to that end, he has put his country on the war rails. This leads to the opinion that only a successful Ukrainian offensive can force the Kremlin to look for a way out. Currently, the Ukrainians are making great efforts to prepare for this offensive, forming new units equipped with recently delivered equipment. Only after the offensive is in full swing will be able to see if it is as much of a game changer as people hope. In my next, and I think I will go more into details about how this offensive can develop. What interests What interests here is the assumption that more depends on the success of the Ukrainian offensive than on the failure of the Russian one. The implication is that Putin is satisfied with the current situation, so the real question is how well his troops will be able to hold their defensive lines in the face of future Ukrainian offensive. But Putin is clearly unhappy with the current situation. Had he been satisfied, he would have offered a ceasefire months ago, hoping and expecting to freeze the territorial status quo. Russia doesn't control all of the territory it currently claims. That's why Russia launched her own offensive in January. Perhaps this was partly done to disrupt Ukrainian cooking, but the main reason was the desire to capture more territory. This offensive is not over yet, and there are areas where the Russian troops can still advance, but so far, all the efforts and expenses have not come to any success. We know if Putin fails to succeed, his minimal aspirations will remain unsatisfied, and his troops will be less able to cope with the forces that Ukraine is about to throw at them. The Ukrainians at the same time managed to keep their limited supply routes to Bakhmut open and launched several counterattacks to relieve the pressure. The Russian High Command backed Private Army Wagner Group to make sure the momentum wasn't lost, and of course, the propagandists seemed convinced of the inevitability of the city's fall. Perhaps Ukraine's willingness to continue the struggle caught them by surprise. Far from Bakhmut, the Russians achieved very little. Numerous small scale inspections were conducted in search of vulnerable places in the positions of Ukrainian forces. Some of them were very large scale. The most serious of them were directed against Uglidar. By the end of the January, it was clear that this battle had resulted in catastrophic losses for the Russian 155th Marine Brigade, which continued to follow an open route to attack Ukrainian positions and suffered serious casualties. Then there was new attacks, but the Russian command apparently largely abandoned this goal. More recently, Russians had great success in operations against Avdiivka village, near the occupied capital of Donetsk region of Donetsk city, where they managed to disable Ukraine's air defense system and, unusually for this war, were able to use aviation in large numbers. However, they're still trying to gather combat power to encircle Ukrainian forces. Ukrainians report that the Russian offensive on Avdiivka is still being held back. Most importantly, the Ukrainians are increasingly confident they will be able to keep Bakhmut. The commander in chief of the Ukraine Armed Forces, Valery Zaluzhny, considers the situation stabilized. Britain's Ministry of Defense said that the Russian offensive had largely stalled due to the extreme exhaustion of Russian forces. General Alexander Sirsky, commander of the ground forces of Ukraine, noted on March 23 that the Russians are losing significant forces and they are running out of the resources. The head of private army Wagner Group Prigozhin, who constantly comments on the Battle of Bakhmut, in which his men fought, warned that they would now face a significant Ukraine force, which he somewhat implausibly estimated at 80,000 troops. While one can never be sure of the representatives of social media posts, some of those made by Russian are extraordinary. There is, for example, a video of survivors from the detachment of 161 people, in which only a few dozen fighters are now left alive. Their claims of taxes to avoid being sent to a direct attack and with no chance to heal if wounded. This account of the desperate experience of the Omsk mobs in the battles for Vuhledar and Avdiivka helps to explain why the Russians could not advance very far. There are stories of heavy casualties, of soldiers advancing only because they would be killed if they will turn back, about inaccurate artillery fire, and commanders who are either absent or indifferent to the fate of their men. So, because of all that, Russia started reassessing its strategy. After the invasion, Russia revised it, and the first review took place back in March 2022 after Russia lost the battle for Kiev and was forced to withdraw her forces from the northern part of Ukraine. This led to a decrease in aspirations both politically and militarily. They decided just to focus on the Donbas region. Then, 6 months after Russian forces made little progress, well, yeah, they were pushed out of the Kharkiv region and lost grounds in Kherson as well. A second reassessment took place. It went in the opposite direction, fending off pressure from uncompromising nationalist critics. Putin has doubled down, raising the political stakes, annexing four regions, mobilizing an additional 300,000 troops, and launching a campaign against Ukraine's vital infrastructure. 6 months later, again, none of these measures advanced the Russian army. Ukraine has been hit really hard, but its relative military status is improving as new Western supplies arrive, though not as quickly as would be desired. But still, it's coming. Putin's strategic choices have narrowed. The Ukrainian victory might be one of the greatest victories in military history, and one of the greatest victories in NATO history, all based on the courage of Ukrainian soldiers without NATO or US troops at all. So, we should definitely support Ukraine to victory, and we need to write just a check to provide it intelligence. We don't have to participate, but we have to contribute financially as much as possible. This is a great victory and a necessary investment in eliminating and degrading a major threat to the world. And Russia will not be a threat again, at least for some time. Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening to my podcast and listen to our early podcasts.